They told me not to come home for Thanksgiving. Just one call. Short, casual, like it meant nothing. But it did. It meant I was no longer needed, no longer wanted, because keeping the peace for my sister mattered more than my place at the table. So I did something I never thought I would. I stopped. I stopped paying the bills. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped being the warmth they never noticed until it was gone. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about realizing the cost of quiet sacrifice and what happens when the one who always kept the fire burning finally walks away. Late October in Frogtown, St. Paul. The wind found every crack in Claire's tiny apartment, slipping through as she returned from another night shift at the distribution center. Her face pale and tired held a quiet defiance as she set down her work bag, filled the kettle, and settled beside the humming space heater. A secondhand magazine lay open on her lap, its glossy pages curling slightly at the edges. The apartment was modest, worn but warm, reflecting the resilience of the woman who lived there. Claire took a slow sip of tea, her eyes distant as flashes of memory drifted through her mind. January. $400 wired at midnight when her father called saying the heat had gone out. March. $900 sent after her mother sobbed about the clanging furnace. September. $1,100 after Sophie, her sister, burned through her savings, chasing another failed project. Claire opened her old laptop, navigated to the Excel sheet she'd kept for 2 years. Every transaction logged. Dates, amounts, brief notes. Mum crying, furnace broken, Sophie overspent again. Each row felt like a small piece of herself given away. The phone buzzed. Claire glanced down. A story from Sophie. Bright smile, cappuccino in hand, caption, chasing dreams. She scrolled past without reaction, fingers grazing the small of her back, sore from lifting crates all night. Sophie, the dreamer who had once ordered 1,000 factory candles, slapped on handmade labels and sold nothing. The loss? Over $16,000. Their parents didn't scold her, they just said, "She's young." Then the phone rang again. This time, Dad. Claire answered, putting him on speaker, already sensing the shift. "Claire, don't come home for Thanksgiving this year," Rick said, casual as ever. "Sophie's been a little tense lately. We think it's best." Claire blinked. "So? I'm not welcome because Sophie's uncomfortable." A pause. "It's just one day, Claire. Don't make this a big deal." Her voice hardened. One day, after $4,800 this year alone. She ended the call. Silence returned, sharp and full. Slowly, Claire placed her cup down, reopened her Excel file, and typed her final entry. Support suspended, 11/2. The room was still. Piano music played faintly from the radio. The tea went cold. The next morning, Claire woke before the sun rose, steam rising from her half-finished mug of tea. She logged into the heating service account, scrolled through familiar tabs, and clicked Cancel Auto Delivery for 422 Elm Street. A notification appeared. Service will end November 2. She stared at the screen, then exhaled. Calm, certain, empty. Meanwhile, in Little Falls, her father Rick sipped his morning coffee, newspaper rustling as Diane cleaned the counter nearby. The house was still warm from residual heating, no one noticing the digital service had been cut. Sophie, ever unbothered, posted a brunch selfie, latte croissant, the caption living, not just surviving. 4 days later, the first message arrived. Claire, the heater seems off. Dad doesn't know how to check it. Claire read it silently, locked her phone and put on her coat. She didn't respond. Instead, she walked to Milkweed Bookstore, wandered through shelves until she found an old paperback, then crossed to the cafe next door. She sat for hours, drinking cinnamon tea while snow drifted outside. On her way home, Claire passed a little girl standing near a bus stop in a threadbare jacket. Her gut twisted. For a moment, she faltered, but kept walking. That night, back home, she unplugged her own heater, plugged in a newer cord. Then she cracked the window open, letting in a bite of cold air. She placed a small dried lavender pot on the sill, once alive, now just a husk. A metaphor, perhaps. Or just something to fill the space. Later, a video call from Madison lit up her screen. "Claire? Sophie's telling people you cut the heat on purpose. She's calling you heartless." Claire's gaze didn't waver. When they see you as a wallet, even keeping them warm becomes a crime. She ended the call, her face still, her mind made of quiet fire. The silence continued, but this time it belonged to her. The Morgan house had become a shell of its former self. The thermostat read 40 DFF, but it felt colder somehow, heavier, lonelier. Sophie lay curled on the living room couch under a thin blanket, her coughs dry and constant. Diane stood at the kitchen sink, trying to scrub a pot, but her fingers were too numb to grip the sponge. Cracks formed on her knuckles, red and raw. Rick layered sweaters over flannel, pretending things weren't as bad as they were. He paced the hallway in silence, jaw tight, refusing to acknowledge what they all knew. The heat was gone, and Claire wasn't coming. The messages began piling up. This isn't about money anymore, this is family. Then another. Fine, pretend you were never part of this family. And finally, blunt and bare, it's 38 DFF, please call me. Claire read every one. She didn't delete them. Instead, she saved each in a folder on her laptop titled, Why I Stopped. No reply, no explanations. Her own life unfolded in quiet contrast. She worked her overnight shifts, came home, peeled potatoes, stirred soup, folded laundry, while jazz played in the background. She found comfort in routine. On weekends, she started making small beeswax candles, pouring them into recycled jars and leaving them outside her elderly neighbors' doors, unsigned. One icy morning, Claire noticed the window frame of her downstairs neighbor, an elderly man with a heavy German accent, had blown open. She knocked, stepped inside, and helped him fix it with duct tape and cardboard. As they worked, he told her about his 3 adult children, none of whom called anymore. His voice cracked, not with anger, but with the weight of resignation. As she turned to leave, he looked at her and said, "You know, sometimes family stops being family the moment they forget to be kind." Claire paused. She looked down at her calloused hands, the small scars along her knuckles from years of lifting, scrubbing, doing. For the first time in a long while, she saw them not just as tools, but as proof of what she'd carried and what she no longer had to. The wind whipped through Frogtown that morning, snow blanketing the sidewalks in silence. Claire was chopping carrots when a sharp knock shattered the quiet. Not hesitant, demanding. She moved to the door, peeked through the peephole, and froze. Rick stood on the porch in an old grey coat, cheeks flushed from cold, hands trembling at his sides. She opened the door just a sliver. Warmth spilled into the hallway. He didn't step in. "Your mother's sick," he said, his voice hoarse. "Sophie won't eat. It's freezing. You shut off the heat, didn't you?" Claire's expression didn't change. "No, I just stopped paying for the entitlement." Rick's brows furrowed. We were all stressed. It wasn't personal. But she didn't let him finish. "I kept records. Every payment, every late-night transfer while I worked double shifts in a torn coat." He shifted, ashamed, then muttered, "You're punishing us over one dinner?" Claire's eyes didn't flinch. "I'm letting you feel what it's like to be excluded from a table you helped keep warm." He didn't argue, just turned, boots crunching against the snow, and disappeared down the street. 3 days later, another knock. This time, softer, hesitant. Claire opened the door to find Diane, hunched in her coat, cheeks red with wind. She held a worn paper bag and a look Claire hadn't seen in years. Regret. "I'm sorry," Diane whispered. "I let you carry too much for too long." Claire said nothing. Instead, she opened the door just a little wider, enough for her mother to glimpse the warm kitchen inside. Bread in the oven, soup simmering. A home built from resilience. "I'm not angry anymore," Claire said, "but I'm no longer the place everyone leans on by default." Diane nodded slowly. Snowflakes landed softly on her shoulders as she turned away, disappearing into the white. Claire watched the door close, not with bitterness, but with quiet certainty. The Morgan house stood still under a grey sky, a battered "for sale" sign planted into the frozen ground out front. Inside, there was little left. No warmth, no laughter, just boxes stacked in corners and the quiet echo of a family falling apart. Sophie had broken up with her boyfriend and been kicked out of her rental. With nowhere to go, she ended up couch hopping in Eden Prairie. Diane was hospitalized with a mild case of pneumonia, the result of too many nights without heat. And Rick, with nowhere else to turn, sold his late father's watch collection, his last tangible inheritance, to afford one final tank of heating oil. It bought them maybe 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Claire's life in Frogtown was calm and intentional. She woke early, stretched on her yoga mat as sunlight crept through the frost-laced window. She brewed herbal tea, toasted bread, and made squash soup in small batches. She went to work without resentment, came home in peace. She no longer gave to prove her worth. Now, she gave because it felt good. On Saturdays, she volunteered at the local shelter, preparing warm meals for the homeless. On Sundays, she visited a nearby nursing home to read aloud to residents who no longer had visitors. For the first time, her kindness felt like a gift, not a tax. Madison called one night. "Claire, Mandy just posted a crying video on social media, saying you abandoned the family in their worst moment." Claire smiled softly. "If someone really wants the truth, they'll find it. If not, it doesn't matter." Madison sighed. "I hate that it came to this." Claire replied, "It's not your fault, but some people only learn value when they lose it." Later that evening, Claire stood in front of her fireplace. She placed a beeswax candle she'd made by hand onto the small altar beside her grandfather's photo. The flame flickered gently, casting golden light against the wall. It wasn't the warmth of obligation, but of self-made peace, a quiet glow born not of sacrifice. The snowstorm came early that January. Temperatures dropped to -20 and the city slowed to a crawl under a thick white hush. Claire stayed in, wrapped in wool, sipping tea by the window when the package arrived. Small, unmarked, left at her doorstep. She brought it inside, peeled away the tape, and opened the lid. Inside was a notebook, worn, familiar. Her mother's handwriting filled the pages, each one detailing meals Claire had loved as a child. Simple things. Tuna casserole, apple cobbler, chicken soup. Between 2 pages lay a folded slip of paper, yellowed at the edges, in her mother's cursive. "I was wrong. You always mattered. Love, Mom." Claire didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She simply closed her eyes and let a small, tired smile rise to her lips, gentle, accepting. Days later, in the heart of another snowstorm, Diane knocked on Claire's door. No bags, no pleading, just her, alone. Claire opened it cautiously, expecting another apology. Instead, Diane said softly, "I didn't come to ask for anything. I just hoped I could hug you if you'd let me." Claire looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she stepped forward. The hug wasn't long. It wasn't emotional or dramatic. It was quiet, real, and enough. They stood in Claire's small kitchen, jazz playing low from the corner speaker. No words, just the sound of the storm outside and the warmth of 2 women, no longer strangers, no longer enemies, just human. Sophie was never mentioned. No one brought up forgiveness. It wasn't necessary. Claire kept living. She still volunteered. She still talked with Mattison. Her life was no longer built on proving anything. It was built on peace, choice, and one hard-earned truth. Scars may remain, but wounds can heal. And some fires, once lit from within, never go out again. Sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is choose yourself. Especially when you've spent years being the one who always stayed, always gave, always bent to keep things from breaking. But peace doesn't come from being needed. It comes from being free. Free to set boundaries, free to let go, and free to heal, even if it means walking away. If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear them. And if you believe in the power of stories to heal, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more. Thank you for being here.